Episode 20. What is democracy good for? That is today's question on the Stand Up with Pete Dominick podcast. Hello, friends, and welcome to the Classroom of Life. That is Stand Up with Pete Dominick, where every show we do our best to fight apathy, learn together from our expert guests about the issues and ideas that matter to you, your family, your community, your country, and your planet. I welcome both David Orr and John Avlon. At about 42 minutes, John comes on to answer that question, what is democracy good for? Thank you very much for joining me, for subscribing to the podcast, and for those of you subscribing on Patreon. Highly recommend you join that community. Exciting things are coming on patreon.com/Pete Dominick. So let's do this. I met David Orr at the National Conservation Training Center a few years back when we were both addressing young people about climate change, sustainability, government, and media. Shortly after meeting him, I got my hands on as much of his writing and work as I could. I've been a massive fan of his mind and voice ever since. He has been one of the most respected voices in the environmental movement for over a generation. He's a recipient of 6 honorary degrees, 6 more than me, and awards, many awards. I can't list them all. He's been a scholar in residence at Ball State, University of Washington, other schools as well. He's lectured hundreds of colleges and universities throughout the U.S. and Europe. He worked in government as well. He's a scholar, a teacher, a writer, a speaker, and an entrepreneur. And since the presidential election of 2016, I know he spent a great deal of time trying to save our democracy from the clutches of authoritarians and autocrats. I am very happy to finally have the great David Orr joining me here on the Stand Up with Pete Dominick podcast. Sir, so good to have you. Thank you so much for joining me.
Well, Pete, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to chat a bit.
Yeah, I love chatting to you, or just even listening to you. I don't even have to be in the conversation. Love reading you, and am so happy that I met you a few years back and that you're in my life, and to have you on the show is awesome. So let's get right to it, because I want to go back to just the election. You've spent, you heard the end of the introduction there, a lot of your time since the election focused on saving our democracy. You held this big conference at Oberlin College where you are a legend. And you had all these amazing people there. I joined as a member of the media. I was in attendance there. Jane Meyer was there, and so many other amazing people, a whole list. Tell me why this has been a focus of yours.
Well, long story short, I think a good bit of what ails us, whether it's environmental or social or equity issues, has been a massive failure of democracy. And the climate change movement in particular highlights this. And Greta Thunberg's selection by Time Magazine as Person of the Year a couple of days ago just highlights this so much. I mean, here, how did we assign a 15 or 16-year-old kid from Sweden to be our moral conscience? How did that happen? And I think it happened because of a massive failure of our political machinery. And so the conference you attended was one that we held about 2 years ago in 2017 on the state of American democracy. And we were asking a question of how did we get to that election? Right. It was a failure on so many levels. I mean, it was voter suppression and gerrymandering, and so many things happened. And it wasn't just Donald Trump. It was a lot of stuff that had happened before. So this failure, if you compare this, let's say, to a house, the house is in disrepair. A lot of deferred maintenance. The roof is leaking, and the foundations are crumbling, and the windows are busted. And it's time to begin to repair the machinery of democracy, and for lots and lots of reasons. Not the least of which is, I don't think we can get through. I think Jim Hansen, when the great climate scientist, said he didn't think we could fix climate without first fixing our democracy. And that is, I think, exactly true. We knew enough years back when I was working as a minor part of the Carter administration as governor of Georgia. We knew enough then to have acted on climate issues much better than we did. We still have no legally binding climate policy. And as everybody knows, right now, the COP meeting in Chile is showing this.
Spain.
Probably Spain, I'm sorry. Is showing this to be a critical problem. I mean, it's just a massive failure. And so carbon emissions continue to rise. This is all governmental failure. So this, for me, this was the kind of the fire in the belly, so to speak, about fixing democracy. And it's not when people say, well, that sounds so liberal or so democratic and so forth. No. What we're aiming for is you can compare this to a football game where there are no referees and no rules and players show up with Uzis and hand grenades. That's not football. That's war. And that's what our politics have become. And so this isn't an endeavor that we're involved in. It's either left or right. This is about the rules of the game. And those rules allow us to keep this conversation about how we do the public business going forward. So all these issues, will never resolve them all to anybody's satisfaction. I mean, government is, somebody once said of marriage, is not an altogether workable solution to a not altogether solvable problem. And government will always be that way. But that doesn't mean you get a divorce or you shoot each other in a bitter battle between spouses. This is about how we conduct the public business in a way that's transparent, honest, open, hopefully far-sighted, and certainly fair. And so, Pete, in some ways, the project that we launched out of that conference in 2017 has three parts to it. The first part is a book titled Democracy Unchained, How to Rebuild Government for the People. It comes out from the New Press in New York in February of 2020. The second part of that will be a series of events across the country with teams of the authors and others about various aspects of this work of repair. So we're looking past the election of 2020, where this is not about Donald Trump. This is not about, per se, the election of 2020. This is about how do we get down to the hard work of repairing democracy, hard and necessary work of repairing democracy, and strengthening democratic institutions to face the big challenges coming at us, like climate change and like issues of equity and so forth. And so this is, we're just entering the second phase of the work. The book is done. We have 35 great contributors to the book, all writing original essays about various aspects of this, from gerrymandering to climate policy to the rights of future generations.
I'm really excited about the book. I hope it's a bestseller. I think there's going to be a lot of ideas and answers just from attending the conference and seeing those speakers. Knowing who you've got in this book is going to be awesome. But let's go back in time a little bit and try to get kind of your understanding when you were a young man working in government, working with, as you mentioned, Jimmy Carter. Like, how were things then? What was the divide like then? How did you see, how did folks generally see the role of government? Because you can identify any period of time in history in the last 30 years and any number of circumstances. It's not just one thing. Everybody wants to make things binary for ratings and for votes. I get it. But I often think about Ronald Reagan talking about government being the problem is where we had this kind of liberal conservative divide really begin. But I'm sure you could probably identify times even before that. What were the dividing lines when you were a young man starting out?
Just to be the history major that I was in college, go back even further to the founding of the country. There were Federalists talking about the Constitution. There were anti-Federalists who wanted small government and the least intrusive government possible. And so there was a bitter dispute around the founding of the country. It started with publication of the Constitution and the Federalist Papers and so forth, dating back to that period between 1763 and 1800, and it really never went away. So there's always been this small government, anti-government strain in American politics. Andrew Jackson's canceling of the National Bank and the Civil War in American history and the battle over the role of corporations and so forth. I think in my life, in my era, if you go back a little before I was born, the Depression, World War I and the Depression began to introduce the ideas that we needed larger government. We needed to regulate banks, and we needed to regulate the airwaves and the exchange of securities and financial kind of things. And eventually we needed to regulate behavior relative to environment and to equity and fairness and so forth. So we began to expand government, but it had its enemies. And enemies, people thought that, gee, there should be no Social Security and there should be no health care for people. And everybody's on their own. And so in a way, this has been a battle over pronouns. On the one side, you have people for whom the major pronouns are I and me and mine. And on the other side, there is a different set of people with different ideas that talk about we and us and ours. And of course, those are flip sides of the same coin. All of us are at some point are individuals for sure, and individual rights are important. And on the other side, the collective we is important. We can't educate our children very well if it's only the parents that have to do it. We can't fight fires or protect ourselves from crime if it's only we that are armed with guns and, garden hoses. At some point, we have to come together collectively. So these are contending viewpoints about how we organize the act of living and our public living together, the public space that we're all part of. We're all citizens and we're all consumers. But think of that as a point on a continuum. And under Ronald Reagan, I think the government was identified as the problem, but get government off our backs. But if you get government off your back, you're leaving the corporations on your back. And so right now, the freedom is defined as the right of very wealthy people to do whatever the hell they want to do. And it's got to have more meaning than that. If you simply leave people vulnerable to the oligarchies and the concentrated wealth and so forth, and wealth now is concentrated in decent amounts at the very top. I mean, all the information we have about income shows that there are some people in the top 100 to 1,000 to 1% that own huge amounts of the country. And 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 people have more wealth than the bottom 50% of Americans. And numbers are probably a little bit worse than that. So you can't run a democracy with that. So these are old tensions in American life that got a lot worse. Hate radio and Fox News and media that began to divide us. And some people make a really good living. I mean, a living that dwarfs what you and I make or can make by keeping people at each other's throats.
Yeah. I want you to expand on that, because that is my biggest argument or point, and it's solely because I'm a member of the media and I've been in and around all of these people for a long time. I understand the incentives, I understand the pay structures and how things work intimately, but I've never been tempted to pursue those ideas because it would seem inauthentic and it would seem damaging. But that's certainly not the case with people across the media spectrum. It's not obviously just on the right, although they definitely do a lot better for the most part. And we can talk about why. But how much of the problem, not to assign percentages, because you can speak to all of these issues and catalysts, and like you said earlier, long before Trump, but how do you look at media today, David Orr? I mean, you strike me as such an intellectual student of the formal academic system and as of life, a teacher of both. And I just don't see you sitting around watching cable news to get any information or opinions or insight, much less listening to the radio of any sort. So how do you see media as the problems? Go into that a little bit.
Well, I think that when we had a less extensive media system, and take the year 1948, and I think I'm correct that the fair and balanced provision that governed the Federal Communications Commission was established, I think, in the law of 1948, I believe, somewhere around there. But what it required was if you used public airwaves, you had to provide fair and balanced coverage of issues. And that was, of course, broken by the Reagan administration in the late 80s. And also with cable news, because it meant that you weren't using public airways, you were using private assets to move information and ideas. So our public control of the system broke down, and we began to divide ourselves into what would have been called media silos. And media silos mean you're just self-contained. You're kind of hermetically sealed in the Fox News thing or the MSNBC News silo or whatever. But the fact is that it was very easy for some people to appeal to that reptilian part of the human brain, the amygdala, and appeal to fear and greed. There's no heavy lifting involved in that. It's easy to get people riled up and fearful and hating somebody who's different. And we're seeing a good bit of that now. You hate immigrants, or you hate other ethnic groups or other religious faith traditions and so forth. That takes no heavy lifting. But I'll tell you, you know as well as I do, much better than I do, that if you're talking about things like sustainability and justice and fairness and so forth, boy, that's heavy lifting. You better be thinking about that, because there are lots of different ways, and right answers are really hard to come by. You have to work hard to get
do you mean if you're talking about those types of issues like economics, you mentioned a few, economics or trade or foreign policy, that they're complicated and they're nuanced, and there are people who write entire books and teach courses about them, is what you're saying, that when we simplify them to sell them to get ratings, that's the problem? Is that what you're saying, or am I missing?
Absolutely. No, absolutely.
Because I think, and you've written about this, and this is a huge issue, and I wonder how important you think of an issue it is, if you don't understand history, and you, as you mentioned earlier, and you don't understand kind of civics and how government works, even a basic fundamental understanding, then you're going to be very vulnerable to be manipulated by Sean Hannity or Rush Limbaugh as to what the past was and what the present is. Does that make any sense?
Oh, it sure does. Absolutely. And it means that the whole idea, the founders of this country knew some things. They were students of human behavior, and they were students of history. They knew about people like Caligula in Roman history and Nero and so forth. But they knew how fragile we are as people, how easy it is for us to hate, and how easy it is for us to form what Madison called factions. We would call them now political parties, and that those things divide us, but they keep us focused on the we and ours and us, without neglecting our individual nature and individual freedoms at all. But it's easy for people to stir up trouble. It's so much easier for somebody to hate immigrants, for example, and want them out of the country and lock them up and so forth, than it is to think about how do we globally accommodate higher temperatures, rising sea levels, falling numbers of species, and so forth. Those are difficult things. And how do you begin to think about that, especially in terms of longer or future generations? So if democracy isn't just a current generation, it's you and me right now and all the people that are living, but it also has to include in some way the rights of generations that are unborn. And this is an old Native American, they've been thinking about the rights of the generation, 7 generations out. But that's complicated. And that means you have to mull things over. You have to slow down a bit. You have to know a lot. And you can't just appeal to people's fears and hatreds and greed to come out with anything approaching decent public policies and politics.
But it's so lucrative.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. You make a lot of money. I'm sure Sean Hannity and
he makes
Tucker,
millions and millions of dollars.
Well, I believe it. It's easy to appeal to the worst side of people and find advertisers that will pay you to do it.
Yeah, that's for sure. So how do you wrote this book, or it's really a compilation of your essays, which I absolutely love. I go back to it, David, all the time. Hope is an imperative. I'm not sure when this was published, 2010. I'm not sure, but it's so good. I highly encourage people to find it and buy it. But my question to you is about that. You've seen a lot in your long life in this country and around the world when it comes to all these issues that we're talking about now and that you've been teaching about for years. You've accomplished so much. You've never backed down from a challenge. What you've been able to do in your life is awe-inspiring to someone like me. And how do you see where we're at now? Because there seems to be a real vacancy of hope. There seems to be so much more fear and negativity and concern and people joking about the end of the world. I mean, you've got climate change, you've got nuclear weapons, but yet, you know, a lot of metrics say we're better than we've ever been in terms of health outcomes and so on. Nonetheless, where do you sit right now on the scale of hope, given what you've seen in your life?
1 to 10 scale. Well, in that book, I said hope is a verb with its sleeves rolled up. If you're hopeful, you have to be acting. You can't sit there and be in despair. You can't retreat into Pollyannish optimism. You have to be doing things. And the grounds for hope right now are I think, these. There is, I think, quite literally a global revolution of active citizens by whatever names and whatever nationalities. I think people now in some ways are more of a mind than we know how to appreciate. If you ask people, do you want climate change? The answer overwhelmingly, both here in the United States and worldwide, is no, we don't want that. Do you want dirty air? No, we don't want that. Do you want to drink dirty water? No. Do you want lots of species around? Yes. Do you want public parks? Yes. So in a way, if you think about standing on the edge of the Grand Canyon, on one side of the Grand Canyon, there are our beliefs and our hopes, and they show up in poll data. And polls on all of these issues are hugely with us. And on the other side of the Grand Canyon are the laws and regulations and policies that we get. And there should be a bridge from one side to the other, connecting what we want with the world we get. And that bridge has been turned into a toll bridge. So if you have money, you get the policies and regulations and laws that you want. And that's part of why we have this massive maldistribution of money, why the rich get richer and richer and everyone else is either getting poorer or staying about where you always have been. And so one side of optimism is to begin to harness that democratic energy, and it crosses liberal, conservative lines. You can be a good liberal, you can be a good conservative, but you still want those things. The questions are often, how do you get there? And those are good questions. You know, there's sometimes conservatives have it right and sometimes liberals have it right. But that's a dialogue that goes on both within parties and between parties, but also within every human being. There's at some points in your life, as you know, that you're going to be liberal on some issues and conservative on others. And as you get older, which is called maturing, you know, your opinions can change. But there's a massive amount of optimism that can be generated by just saying, hey, the collective we has never been in some ways stronger. If you ask about technology, if somebody said, let's power the world by sunshine and efficiency, and have also, by the way, regenerative agriculture and forestry practices, could that change the world? And the short answer is yes, it could. We're not stuck. We don't have to be heating the planet to the point where we suffer as a species and eventually go extinct. We don't have to do that. That's a future that would be chosen. It's our kind of our default setting, but it doesn't have to be. We have the means to do it. And the third form of optimism, or reason for optimism, we have every reason of self-interest and just narrow economics to do it because it makes economic sense. And the issue, again, and purpose for this book, Democracy Unchained, is to focus on what's the cork in the bottle? What's the thing keeping us from a future that we all want? And it's politics. It's the way we've organized the public business. We give far too much control to money. We have way underinvested in civic education and underinvested in our people and underinvested in things that make this a better society. So the goal of our project is not the election of 2020. Donald Trump somehow, some way will depart the White House, but the hard work of repairing and rebuilding democratic institutions will begin. How do we want to conduct our public business? And what are the agencies that allow us to do it and the laws that allow us to do it in a way it's fair and transparent? And I would start with, you mentioned Jane Mayer a moment ago, but I'd tell you, start with Jane Mayer's proposal, get dark money out of politics. Why do we have Citizens United? Why do we allow oligarchs secretly to buy up elections? Why do we give the Koch brothers so much power and influence? And it's so easy to overlook those things, but we live in a corrupted democracy.
I think I couldn't agree more, and I think that's such a big issue. And I also fear that people don't, it's one of those difficult issues for people to understand. You start talking about Citizens United and the Supreme Court. I try to break everything down so people with my intelligence and education can understand them. And it seems, much simpler to just say money corrupts people. But at the same time, it's also really easy to just look at the members of Congress or even at the state level and say that they're corrupt or that they're greedy and they're there to get rich. But I don't believe that. I've met and interviewed countless numbers of congressmen and women, and you've worked with and for them and met so many of them. And it's really just the system. The system is to get elected. I was thinking about running for Congress back in October for about an hour and a half. And the system, you have to raise millions of dollars to run for a House seat, tens of millions for a Senate seat, and billions to be president. And a couple guys that are running now, Bloomberg and Steyer, that are self-funding billionaires. And it's not that it corrupts so much. It's that you have to keep going back to certain people and bundlers and getting that money for your campaign so that you can then do the will of the people. But you can't do the will of the people if you don't have the money to run a campaign. And we could talk about why you need the money to run a campaign, to publicize who you are and advertise and all of that. But how do we explain how money corrupts government and congressional representatives and votes in a way and why do we disagree on that? Why is that a liberal conservative divide? There's a few issues where I don't understand why we are arguing. It's too much money to have to run a campaign, and then you have to vote to pay back the industries and special interests and bundlers. It's broken, and it's not uniquely American, but it seems to be worse here than, say, Canada or Australia.
Well, you're right. I think you would have been a great congressperson, by the way.
Got $1 million?
No, I don't. There's the problem. I don't think if the question were put to the public and take out the propaganda, it's a little hard. Let me step back here and go back to media for just a second. It's a little bit hard to run a democracy when there's this constant stream of misinformation and venom being injected into the system. You think of trying to be healthy if there's a constant infection in your body, constantly streaming poison through your body. And misinformation was one of the things the founders feared. The founders of the country only had a couple of things they thought were indispensable to democracy. And one was the free press, and one was education. And both of them spoke to how we think and how well we think and how well informed we are. And if there is a deliberate attempt to mislead and lie to the public, and we do it, it isn't just a right side of the thing. I mean, we do it probably pretty uniformly through the system. But it's really hard to run a democracy if misinformation, that venom, is being fed into the system continually. And unfortunately, it is. And I think the internet has made it worse. Russian bots make it still worse than that.
Or any government can have those bots and infiltrate any other government's conversation. We've done it as well here in the U.S. with other countries. But I want you to pick a topic where misinformation has really corrupted the ideology of citizens. And I'm going to tell you that I want you obviously to pick the issue of climate change, because you have been at the forefront of this issue since the beginning. You understood what the problem was. You understood the greenhouse effect. You were concerned about it. You knew what was causing it. Did you also, even back in the, I guess, late 80s, understand that the fossil fuel companies, coal, oil, and gas, also knew what the problem was and were putting out this misinformation and venom? How am I doing?
Doing great. And I think that is the issue. If we don't get that one right very, very quickly, then we're toast. And the odds of us holding global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees centigrade, not Fahrenheit, are diminishing almost by the day. Our carbon emissions are said to go up by about 0.6% this year. Last year was higher, but they're still going up positively. And CO2 and other heat-trapping gases, if you take, by the way, this is a technicality, I don't want to get into this, but very far, but I would say this. Carbon emissions are higher than they've been in hundreds of thousands of years, long before there was something called civilization on Earth. But if you add to that number, the other heat-trapping gases like nitric oxides and methane and so forth, the number gets much closer to 500 parts per million. We do not want to stay there. So if you were an airline pilot and looking down at your dashboard and this aircraft at 35,000 feet, all you can see is red lights flashing. And that is the thing. We can crash this thing called civilization because we simply violated the rules by which this Earth works. You cannot trap heat. I mean, think about being in a car on a Houston parking lot, asphalt parking lot on a July day, and you roll up the windows. The ambient temperature outside may be 95 degrees, but incoming solar radiation will heat the car up, and you're sitting there, and the temperature goes to 100, 115, 120, and so forth. It'll kill you. And that's what we're doing with the planet. We're simply double glazing the atmosphere, as somebody put it. So sunlight comes in, but the heat can't escape. And so we're heating up the planet. Somebody once figured out that this is roughly an incandescent Christmas bulb light for every square meter on the Earth. That's a lot of heat. Somebody else figured out that is equivalent to exploding, I forgot what the number was, but hundreds of Hiroshima-sized atomic bombs every day. And so that's what we're doing to the planet. We're simply heating up the Earth. And that's the one thing we have to solve. Somebody once said that if whatever your issue, it's a lost cause on a heating planet or a dying planet. And so, yeah, you're right. But again, Pete, there's reason. If we chose to do differently, we could. We could power the Earth by current sunshine. It falls 100 times more every day than we would ever use. And efficiency and better design of cities. And it would be, people say you just can't afford that. You can't afford not to.
Do you have any... Yeah, I agree with you. Do you have, sorry to interrupt, do you have any confidence in or hope in future technologies that capture carbon, capture greenhouse gases, so that if we're not able to power our planet and our lives with clean, renewable energies, we might be able to capture the greenhouse gases that we are putting out? I mean, there's a lot of these kind of, I don't know how you would describe them, but they certainly seem far-fetched Hail Marys of technology. But some people argue that innovation, we'll have to innovate ourselves out of this in terms of on the other end, which is grabbing all the pollution and putting it back in the ground or getting rid of it somehow.
Well, two comments. One is that if you're pulling carbon out of the atmosphere, the means by which you do it have to themselves be carbon neutral. You've got to do it at a scale that really solves the problem. And that's roughly 9 billion tons per year. And that just breaks you even. That doesn't reduce it. You got to do it at a price you're willing to pay at a time frame that really solves the problem in the time we have remaining before it gets completely out of control. So those are fairly tough hurdles to get over. But assuming that's technically possible to do that in a carbon neutral sort of way and so forth, then the other issues are there, aren't they? There are the issues of politics and inequity and nuclear weapons and species extinction and all those other things. That doesn't go away. So in some ways, this is like the old quadratic equations you had in high school mathematics. You have to solve lots of problems simultaneously to get the right answer on that right side of the equals mark. So these are things that if we can do it, let's do it. What was
the worst grade you got in high school?
Oh, well, it's probably I don't really remember my high school report card, but I was a B+ student, B+ A- student in high school. More interested in playing football and sports and girls than other things.
Fair enough. All right. Well, let me ask you a couple more minutes here. I just absolutely love talking to you, and if we don't get to solutions and conclusions, that's fine, because I want to keep talking to you on this show, and really, really excited about the book that's coming out February 2020 from the New Press, Democracy Unchained, How to Rebuild Government for the People, an amazing collection of essays aggregated by yourself, all these brilliant folks. Explain how or pick an institution that we need to rebuild, that we need to create more vibrancy with, because that seems to be one of the big problems, that there's been such a loss of respect and effectiveness with so many of our institutions. Maybe they've been captured. Maybe there's just not a lack of faith in them. Maybe there aren't smart enough people. Maybe they're not well funded enough. How do you see the degradation of democratic institutions in this country? Maybe pick one or two.
Well, let me just pick one. I think that one of the authors in the book, Ganesh Sitaraman, has written a couple of brilliant books lately. His new book called The Great Democracy. But several years ago, he wrote a book called The Crisis of the Middle Class Constitution. And the biggest issue, I think, the largest part of the blockage in the system towards something that's fair and a governmental system that can solve problems and actually does what we used to do in the 40s and 50s and 60s, is money. I don't see a future for democracy where money continues to accumulate at the very, very, very top of the system. And it deteriorates. We don't have enough money for our schools or public transit or for high-speed rail or for cleaning up cities or for any number of other public causes, because it's all gone to the wealthy. So I am with all of those people left and right who believe you have to have a viable middle class. And that's not to say you have to have everybody making the same amount of money at all, but it is to say that you can't run a democracy that works. And by works, I mean solves problems, without having people have a certain level of economic security. The middle class that we look back on nostalgically in the 50s, and the country had lots of problems in the 50s, but there was a pretty solid middle class that was like having a big anchor on a boat or ballast in the bottom of a boat. It kept things fairly even, but also making sure that there's access, equal access, regardless of race and religion and so forth, to that middle class world. And so we've disinvested in so many things, public transportation and public schools and so on and on. We've disinvested in things that built the middle class. I don't see a democracy working, and I don't see, you get into defending democracy, it's a tough thing. Winston Churchill's famous comment that it was the worst form of government except for all the others ever tried.
Yeah. And the thing that I don't think you mentioned, and the one that to me personally right now is the most kind of interesting and crucial, is healthcare and health insurance.
Absolutely.
When I ended my run, basically my contract, they didn't renew my contract at SiriusXM. I'm now on the open market, and luckily is a weird word to say, because luckily I'm in New York State, where we have the exchanges and we have the Medicaid expansion. There are other states that don't have the Medicaid expansion. The point is it's $2,500 for my family of four. And I have to now think about that before I think about almost anything else, even my mortgage payment to some extent. And I'm talking to a friend of mine who's in Canada. He's an actor. He's a single guy, isn't working that much, but he's sitting around playing his guitar, David, because he just, needs to work. Whereas I need to get health insurance. And the idea, I'm not trying to play a violin for myself. I'm trying to say I now relate to so many other Americans that have to spend a certain amount of time in their mind being concerned and working and, just to make that. And that is nowhere else in the civilized world do individuals, hardworking people with educations, aren't making excuses, have to worry about that much to pay for their health insurance, much less anything at all.
Yeah, I agree. And that's part of the economic bargain in society. And for people who say, well, you just can't afford a massive, healthcare program for people, Medicare for all or whatever, by whatever name.
You absolutely can. If we can afford this military budget, we've built this massive military to fight threats that barely even exist anymore. Our democracy was infiltrated by a bunch of hackers. I mean, that's the threat in China and Iran and, of course, in Russia. And we've got this, $1 trillion military. Of course we can pay for health insurance. Is that too simple?
No, and I think if you ask, why are we still building the $22 billion contract we signed to build more submarines 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago? We don't need more submarines with missiles. We don't need to figure out how to blow up the world more efficiently and so forth. Let's move toward a very different world. And I'll tell you, Pete, if you and I were selected to, we were given, let's say, $300 billion to defend a country, could we do it? You bet we could.
Your national security threat is not your national. I always say this: the national security threat is not terrorism; it's heart disease.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, which are you more worried about? Heart disease and cancer, or a terrorist attack? I mean, be honest with yourselves, is what I've...
Well, we also, it pays sometimes to understand your, quote, adversaries in this, unquote. And there are bad people out there. I have no doubt about that.
Right.
But we tend to make some of the threats that we then have to, quote, defend against. It's kind of a Rube Goldberg self-perpetuating device. And so that $750 or $800 billion annual, quote, defense budget is in some ways an offense budget. And to maintain upwards of, 1,000 military bases around the world, that is an intrusion in many places. It's not just about safety and security. It's oftentimes about protecting corporate interests at public expense. And until we get honest about what we do militarily around the world, Eisenhower feared this dramatically. And Madison, a long time ago, said the fastest way to destroy democracy is by militarization and war. And so there are some real issues, and there are fundamental issues. And again, these are complicated things, but it's so easy, again, to arouse people's fear of the other and these threats that people pose. And the threats always get defined by people who profit from their being the threat in the first place.
Yes. Yes. Amen. All right, let's end it there because I've taken up a lot of time, but I want to come back to you and take up more of your time. You are one of the most intelligent and one of the most morally sound humans I've ever met in my life. When I think of you, I smile because I find you to be someone who inspires me with your experience doing everything you've done for all of the right reasons. I love you, man. I really, really do. And I so appreciate you joining me today and the work that you've done and the way that you've led throughout your life.
Well, Pete, thank you so much, and same back to you. And I appreciate the time with you and with your audience.
All right, we'll talk very soon, I hope. Thank you, sir.
Hey, happy holidays.
You too.
Bye, Pete.
All right, bye, David Orr. Oh, that's what we call an audible hang-up these days. All right, let's continue our conversation about the future of democracy with another really good friend of mine who I like a lot, who I've been talking to for years on the radio and on television. He's now one of the big shots over at CNN, where he does the reality check on the New Day program almost every day. He's the former editor-in-chief of the Daily Beast. He's an author. He's a historian. He's John Avlon, and he's joining me right now. I think he is in his... You have an office at CNN. I was there the other day, but I couldn't find it. I think I was on the wrong floor for you. Doesn't matter.
Well,
don't tell people what floor
you're on. We're going to fix that next time.
By the way,
I won't, but show you all my pictures.
Yeah,
mostly of you, actually, which is really creepy.
Your office has tons of pictures of me up? How inspiring.
Unexpected, but disturbing.
Really funny that's the joke you made, because now I'm going to spend money to order a giant full-size cardboard cutout and the creepiest of poses and outfits and just leave it there, and you're going to have to allow for it.
I'll just break it out when you come here. Otherwise, I'll keep it in my children's room.
Yeah, kind of like what you do with your in-laws. Not you, me. Okay. So, by the way, let's get very serious here. Sorry for the hard pivot, but you and I have talked about this, I think, off the air. Maybe we talked about it when I was at SiriusXM, the old show, but you do have an office at CNN, and CNN has become a target, unfortunately, for a lot of unhinged, violent people. And I wonder how you deal with that day to day, because I feel like, that wasn't so much of an issue earlier in your career, in the many iterations of your career, that you had to really kind of have that in your mind. Is that something that you and others kind of deal with on a regular basis? How do you deal with that?
Yeah, look, I think, unfortunately, dealing with threats has become part of the job in journalism in this era. And it's something that has grown over time. Something that you need to become accustomed to and use your judgment in how you deal with it. There's no cure for crazy, and there's a lot of that out there, and a lot of the things are just meaningless threats that are enabled by digital technology.
Right.
It becomes really easy on Twitter and other semi-anonymous vehicles for people to say things that they would never do, or certainly or never say into your face.
Right.
It's a fascinating dynamic. If you can discuss something with somebody one-on-one, you're much more likely to find common ground. And it's more difficult to demonize people that you don't know, that you're not confronting face-to-face. But that's the universe we're in, and we are living in an era where the larger drumbeat is to demonize people you disagree with. That's one of the functions of hyperpartisan media. It's one of the things that's come out to this current approach to politics that we're dealing with in our country. The demagogue's classic recipe has always been throughout history, us against them, which is the opposite of our country's ideal, which is, the us out of many one, e pluribus unum. But so you deal with it. For me, this is not a new phenomena. It has been growing over the last several years. I've been doxxed probably a half dozen times.
Really?
For me, sure. But the greater threat, I think, is, and for me, folks have gotten fairly hip to where the line is. But when people start referencing guns or referencing your family, that elevates it to a no joke zone for me.
I'm surprised that you have gotten doxxed, or that you've gotten many threats, because you're not a demagogue, you're not a flamethrower, you're not a hyper partisan. You are a very calm, thoughtful guy in your demeanor and in the way that you deliver your thoughts, opinions, and analysis on CNN or anywhere else. You've always been that way. It kind of makes me sad to think that they're even going after a guy like you.
Well, I think very often, for the cult of polarization to work, in some ways, you need to demonize folks in the center even more to keep the polarization in place. Huh. This is something I wrote about in Wingnuts. I mean, the hunt for heretics, particularly within political parties, is always unusually intense. They would rather focus their fire on perceived disloyal Republicans or centrist Democrats if you're coming from an extreme partisan position, because those folks are the greatest threat to your tribal unity and cohesion. And that's often enforced, as we're seeing in our era, through fear and greed and a desire to intimidate dissent into silence. But it is an irony, because the entire point of my work, all my writings, all my books, at the end of the day, distills to warning folks about the dangers of hyperpartisanship and polarization. I just did a huge series on CNN, 3 essays about polarization, culminating with an interview with Ken Burns, which I love doing.
Oh, cool! I didn't know that one.
Check it out. You'll dig it.
I read and shared at least one of them, and I wanted to talk about that, with you today. Sure. 9 Ways to Stitch America Back Together is really good. You can find it.
That's the solutions piece. I appreciate that.
A lot of solutions. But why Ken Burns?
Ken, look, I think, Ken, who I really love and admire, and watched everything he's done, and I think is one of the great storytellers of our time and a real influence on me. If you look at his work, at the end of the day, he's telling a consistent story. It's the story of America, but it's also the story of Unum. It's about how we overcome our divisions and differences. And, America's always been diverse to different degrees and ways that we might not always recognize, but we've always been an ambitious, audacious experiment, because we're the only country in the world founded on an idea and an ideal, not a tribal identity. And there have always been forces that have tried to focus on separation and separatism. And so it's, this is a new version of an old American story that I think's become more toxic over time, because we've never had someone who preached us against them reach the presidency. and never had social media, which has been a real compounding factor. But it was a really interesting conversation about the kind of figures who've broken those divisions in the past. And I'm talking, everyone from Abraham Lincoln to Johnny Cash, who we talked about, who played a fascinating role during the Vietnam War in terms of mediating pro-war and anti-war forces at the time. Anyway, it was a great conversation, and I love Ken, and I think he's one of our great storytellers. But one of the things, I think history does show also is, Lincoln, as you know, I'm writing a book about Lincoln right now.
Yeah.
And he joked to one of his aides on election night, 1864, that it was a sort of a perverse curiosity of his life and history that he, who had been focused, who was not a vindictive or bitter person, who had been focused on trying to unite the nation, even in the run-up to Civil War and after, would be the target of so much hatred himself. And we see that dynamic in history. And look, I think you got to have moral courage to live and lead in a democracy. That means speaking out and stepping out. But very often, the people who the extremes most hate are the people who are trying to bridge divides. And that's a role I think we all need to be willing to play.
So you have been covering this impeachment. You've been covering this president. You've been doing this a really long time. And I wonder how you would frame where we're at right now. I wonder specifically if you think when it comes to impeachment or any of the, forget impeachment, any of the defenses of this president by Republicans, is it as simple as they know that they need to support him to get reelected? Or is it a lot more complex where I start to think that they really do believe in him, or they really do believe at least that he hasn't done anything very wrong other than, sometimes his tone and rhetoric on Twitter? Because it's very hard for me, and I think a lot of other Americans, to understand why Republicans in the House, and even worse, a lot of them in the Senate, where it's different, that they actually support this man just as a man, because he's got, in my opinion, John, and maybe you think this is too harsh, but I honestly don't think that that Donald Trump has any redeeming human or character qualities, like none. I think he only cares about himself, and always, long before he was president, ran for office. So do these Republicans that are defending him, do they really believe in him and support him, or is it just about their reelection?
So, look, first of all, everyone has some redeeming quality somewhere. But part of, I think, the frustration of covering the current era fairly, and I think that's a vitally important characteristic in all coverage and analysis, is to recognize that we do have asymmetric polarization in our country, that we're caught in a cycle where fear is being used to divide folks and to create false unity. I think fear and greed are the glue of this coalition to a large extent. It's the subject of an essay I'm writing, because I think it's obviously the opposite of the Christmas season, but I think these forces are much more powerful and at play in our politics and other places than we recognize. Look, we've had 3 impeachments in the last 45 years, only one in the first 200 years of the American Republic. And in the first 2 cases, every case is different, but there was a degree of bipartisanship in place. You got to remember that, support for Bill Clinton's impeachment never exceeded 35%. On the day he was impeached by the House in December of 1998, his approval rating went up to 73%. Donald Trump's been at 50% impeach and remove. That's higher than Nixon ever got, except in the last month before he resigned. So he's in a peculiar position historically, but because of polarization, we're not seeing the normal kind of bipartisan breakaway based on constituency or Congress we typically see. What is stunning and troubling to me, and this is where there's a real departure, and I think we need to be wide awake about what this means for our country and our culture, is that I had assumed a month ago, 2 months ago, the Republicans would basically land on this closing argument. What he did was bad. we would never want a Democratic president to do it to a Republican. But to impeach and remove this president for this less than a year from the next election is too extreme a punishment. Now, can disagree or agree with that, but it's a reasonable position to end up on. The president, however, insisted through the White House, his own Twitter feed, the White House official statements, a degree of denial as the core defense, insisting that he had done nothing wrong, despite all the consistent testimony we've seen from his own appointees and staffers, that it was a perfect call, that this was a sham, illegal impeachment, all this stuff, which is a contradiction in terms, with a passing, awareness of the Constitution. I am surprised and stunned at how quickly Republicans have fallen in line behind that unreality. What they know in private to be unreality.
Right.
So you ask, how does that happen? Is it purely political self-interest? Largely, yes. So you got a president who's deeply historically unpopular in the country as a whole, but very popular among Republicans. Partisan media has played an important role in propagating this unreality, but also polarization in the districts through the rigged system of redistricting,
right,
which means that they're afraid of losing a closed partisan primary. They're afraid of losing the base because otherwise they got lifetime employment. And if they want a future in the party, even if they are not running for re-election, they have so far refused to break ranks. And a couple of people finding their courage of their convictions is easier to walk together than walk alone, although it shouldn't be, because as Andrew Jackson once said, one man with courage makes a majority. But you haven't seen that kind of principled breakthrough in public, despite what they may say in private. And one of the key jokes of our time, the Republican consultant Mike Murphy joked that if in the Senate, if impeachment were a secret ballot, you'd have 30 votes in favor of impeachment, to which Jeff Flake, the former senator from Arizona, said, no, that's not true. You'd have at least 35. And it speaks to the degree to which there is a massive gap between what a lot of these folks say and believe in private and what they're saying in public. But the fact they've adopted unreality, refusing to deal with the facts of the testimony entirely, because the facts are not on their side. They've just adopted the president's impulse to deflect and project. Lee Zeldin, a congressman from the 1st District in New York, said that the Democrats in Congress have only proved by pushing forward their articles of impeachment that they are the ones who should be impeached for abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. And that is a perfect distillation of kind of the reflexive know-nothing teamism we're dealing with. Forget the facts. Accuse your opponents what you've been credibly accused of. That's the president's impulse, and that's what we're seeing from Republicans on the panel, unfortunately, because we need to find a way to reason together. But if we refuse to recognize common facts, we got a real problem that's even bigger than impeachment.
One of the other things that you've mentioned.
How about that for a filibuster, for God's sake?
That wasn't a filibuster. I was hanging on every word, as I always do. I never really zone off when you're talking, whether it's on your reality checks on CNN or when I'm talking to you on the radio. I really stay in the moment. I don't even think, like I sometimes do in interviewing other people, about what my next question is going to be. I don't know. Maybe it's because we're good friends and I feel so comfortable with you. But I even though I don't always agree with every word you say, it's not about, me making...
Weird if you did.
Well, it's not about mounting an argument either. It's just, this is a conversation, and I think you're obviously a super smart guy, and that's why I want to ask you my next question about something that you say this a lot. You use this phrase, and I've stolen it many times now. Not that it's yours, but this idea of situational ethics. You and I have argued probably more than other things in the past about economic ideas, and I can hang. I don't know that I've ever, scored any points with you, but
yes, you have.
Well, one issue that you have always been, more concerned about than, economic progressives like myself or other, economic, rather liberal economists is debt and deficit. And I just find the situational ethics, as you say, to be more profoundly obvious on this issue with this president and with this economy than, you know, almost any other thing that we could point to, and there's a lot. When it comes to the rising debt and deficit under this Republican president, they're silent as a mouse, whereas they were screaming about it under the next president. And you know, if a Democrat wins, they're going to start screaming about it again. Help me understand what your thoughts are on that issue and why they don't have to answer for it, including, by the way, Paul Ryan, who skipped town after he added billions to the deficit with the tax cut.
Oh, it was the last thing he did. So I did a reality check on this a while ago that I think is held up, and it was about how GOP deficit hawks have turned into crickets, because what basically Republicans have admitted, and I don't think they can be allowed to forget this, is that apparently deficit and debt only matters when a Democrat is president. And you can't say that enough. Now, here's the second problem. Deficit and debt are forces, excessive deficit and debt. A little bit of deficit and debt's no big deal. Excessive deficit and debt is a force that has historically brought down empires. Math doesn't really care what party's in power. And so part of the problem of the rising deficit and debt in an economic expansion, the longest one in our history, began under Obama, has continued under Trump, combined with the fact that we're probably likely to need slightly larger government in the future to deal with large crises like climate change, aging population, the impact of AI on lower skilled jobs in the middle class, means we've got a real problem coming down the pike. You know, you can sacrifice a lot for the short-term bounce that you get from tax cuts without closing loopholes and ignoring the larger forces of deficit and debt. And when a Democrat comes in and Republicans try to find religion on the subject, you just got to say really clearly you got no credibility on that. The second problem, though, is the left isn't going to like, is that doesn't mean you can ignore the problem indefinitely. That's a disaster.
Right. And you actually, I was somewhat surprised to see you mention Andrew Yang in this piece at CNN about you giving him credit for at least identifying the obvious issue and future concern, well, present concern of what automation is doing. Because, you know, when you think about jobs being automated, that means actual people not paying taxes in a traditional way as well. I mean, you can connect automation to...
Oh, the downstream effect's massive, yeah.
Is that what it's called?
No. It's not. My point is that, like, it's not just not paying taxes into the system. I mean, it's massively dislocating and destabilizing for our society. And you know, it's not that I, you know, anything resembling endorsing Andrew Yang for president, but he deserves credit for two things, at least it seems to me. One, I think he has been one of the most effective, you know, single issue candidates. I know his supporters will say it's more than that, but he ran for president primarily to raise the alarm about this emerging issue that wasn't getting a lot of attention. And he has been enormously disciplined in his communications and his messaging in terms of bringing attention to it. And to that extent, his campaign does us all a service. And that's one of the points I made in that section of the piece.
So let me ask you about another issue that you met. How much more time do I have with you?
Let me look.
You got to go. He's got a family. He's got a job. What time do you get up now, by the way, to get to? You're on CNN.
Usually 4:45, 4:30. I got probably another. I got another 5-10 minutes.
Okay. So thank you. Thank you for each and every one of your minutes.
For you, anything.
You're the greatest. All right. Well, then I'd love to come over for dinner and stay at your house for a couple weeks.
You're welcome.
So you talk a lot about, by the way, as soon as I mention this word, people are going to be like, ugh, what does it even mean? So stay with me, folks. And you explain it, maybe sex it up a little bit with specific examples. But you write about this in this series of pieces in terms of, you know, how we basically have to save democracy, which is part of the theme, certainly, of today's show. I talked with David Orr earlier. He also cares a tremendous amount about history the way you did and talked about it. But the importance of understanding civics and obviously teaching it in school and so on. But my opinion is that the hate-driven media, the ratings-driven media, especially on radio, but certainly on a lot of different elements of cable news as well, specifically on Fox, and we could talk about YouTube and just conversations with your friends and family and coworkers, is this lack of understanding of history, this lack of appreciation for the founding fathers' understanding, as David Orr mentioned, even about human behavior, much less civics itself. When you don't understand how this country was created and how our government is supposed to operate, it's very easy to be manipulated by a savvy demagogue on the radio or television. Help me understand why civics
or in politics.
Sure.
So this is basic, and part of the reason we're in this mess is because we cut civics education from the public school curriculum. And we're, you reap what you sow when it comes to education. George Washington, you've heard me say this before because it was a main point in his farewell address that I wrote Washington's Farewell about. He said that enlightened opinion was essential to self-governing society. Enlightened opinion. So it's not enough to simply have an opinion. It's got to be rooted in real knowledge, in actual understanding. And one of my very favorite quotes is Daniel Patrick Moynihan: everyone's entitled to their own opinion, but not their own facts. We have cut civic education. We have cut American history, and we're reaping what we've sown, because people end up being able to be sold a bill of goods, and they don't adequately understand or appreciate that this country is different. Democracy is not a spectator sport. You have a responsibility whether you like it or not. If you don't, there are plenty of places to live where you can focus on getting yours, and you don't need to actually take responsibility for the direction of your society. But democracy is not that form of government. But we haven't communicated that sense of civic responsibility, and that history is essential. You can't understand the present unless you understand the past, particularly a country with America's past, warts and all. What John Lewis famously said, we all came here, maybe we all came here in different boats, but now we're all in the same boat. You got to understand all of it to have an intelligent conversation about politics and policy and the direction of our country, to have a vision of the future that you want to work towards, because you want to leave the country better to our kids. And I'm not sure we're doing that right now. So in the essay, I talk about a couple groups who are doing it, but also I got one idea that I put forward there that I think is a reasonable one, which is that every graduating high school senior should have to take and pass a citizenship exam that new Americans take. Not too much to ask. Basic civics and American history, but you shouldn't be able to graduate from high school without passing that.
I read that and thought it was really interesting and profoundly simple, because.
Thank you.
Yeah, because.
Just like me.
No, not at all. You're neither of those. Although I did want to have one more joke question to you, which is, you're on TV every morning, and I do think that you wear almost every morning a dark, like a navy suit. And I'm wondering if.
Not every day, but often.
It's either gray or blue, right?
Yeah, I mean I'm not going to be your fashion plate.
I know, but that's mostly everybody who's an anchor on.
So blue's my favorite color. I have one blue suit that I have two of because I like it a lot, and then occasionally I'll mix it up, not just to because you can't wear literally.
You don't need to. I mean, I don't give a shit about it. It's almost like it's burdensome in a way to, well, what am I going to wear on TV today, much less at work. But I always, I don't notice it much. You're always sharp. But anyway, so my question though,
as long as you wear pants, Pete, remember that's the key.
Do you always wear? Well, you do your reality check with a full body shot, so you always have to wear pants. I don't know about John Berman, but the idea for a civics test, or the same test that immigrants have to take, is fascinating, because I always say people who lived in another country, who've moved here and have become citizens, are more appreciative and potentially more patriotic than those of us who have only lived here, because we, by our own nature, we kind of take it for granted. We don't know what else there is.
Such an important point, and it is a very old story. I mean, the reason you and I have had this debate, but the reason some folks can accuse me of being almost cheesily patriotic in the past is because my grandparents were immigrants, and they absolutely loved and appreciated this country, and they communicated that to me, in that I had an obligation to the opportunities they provided, and they were able to provide those because of the opportunities that America gave them. And I think sometimes folks get a little cynical about our country, and they don't appreciate how we look from the perspective of other nations, how America itself, for all our imperfections, is a remarkable place of opportunity. And opportunity is enough. And we have to maintain that. We have to expand that. We have to get closer to our ideas and our ideals constantly. But that is a great gift, and the country is something to deeply appreciate. And it's not a birthright that gets automatically handed down. When I was reporting Wingnuts and about the initial reaction against Obama, one of the things I kept seeing at rallies when I talked to folks, sometimes they were holding some pretty unhinged signs. They'd talk about how many generations their family had been in America. That's great. That doesn't mean that you're automatically more patriotic than anybody else at all. It's something you got to earn and learn and appreciate that very often. And I do think this is something we need to keep encouraging in immigrants in our country through the public education system, but it often just exists because they choose to come here, is our history and our civics. It's basic. It's super important.
It really is.
It's vitally important to what make America work.
Yeah, I want to talk more about that. Somebody's got to do, I'm sure there's been documentaries and books written about it, but there's got to be a better way. You've been screaming about this for years, but there's got to be a better way to make this point about civics, what it is and why it's important, because it's so easy to minimize and demagogue everything and not understand basic civics and the historical origins of our country. And by the way, how other nations put values on them in their education system. But for now, I will let you go because you have a life and a job and you're doing this out of the kindness of your heart. But I hope folks will.
My brother, I'm on Team Pete, man. Whatever I can do for you, always.
I appreciate it, man. I will talk to you very soon, John Avlon. And I gave so you know, I did give you an illustrious introduction before we got on the phone and on the way out. Follow John on Twitter at John Avlon. People so badly want to make your name Avalon. It is not. It's Avlon. No second A. Watch him on CNN. Read him at CNN.com. He is just simply one of the best people and smartest people. You do not have to agree with him, and he is happy when you disagree with him. So, as always, my friend, thank you very much.
All right, my brother. Be good. Let's catch up soon, all right?
I hope so. I'll talk to you soon. All right. There he goes. John Avlon. Yeah, audible hang up and the beep, beep, beep. Okay, that is all we have for today. That's all I have for you today. David Orr, John Avlon. I love talking to both of them about democracy, about history, and about the present. And I hope that you enjoyed it. And go back and check out what we did earlier this week, earlier podcast. This was the 20th episode, 2 guests today. Want to do more of that, give you more variety of guests to listen to. Tell me who you want to hear. Tell me what you want to talk about. Give your compliments, your criticism, your ideas. standupwithpete@gmail.com and join the community on Patreon, where a whole bunch of really cool people are having an awesome conversation. Check us out, patreon.com/Pete Dominick. And that is all for today. Thank you.